Okay, so we've just been talking about high involvement conversation styles and high considerateness conversation styles. And I was going to point out that there's kind of a third thing. Um, and these can all be visualized actually with a game that I used to play with a friend of mine in the Bay years and years ago. So if you imagine that this is a talking object, and suppose that my two hands are kind of um, uh, the two conversationalists. So high involvement goes like this: blah 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 blah. It's not going to work very well if I drop it. Anyway, And so the point is, there's a grabbing back and forth. Like I'm taking the talking. Now I get to talk. Now I get to talk. With high considerateness, it looks more like this: blah 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 blah. They're sort of handing each other the talking. Um, and the kind of culture that we were sort of nurturing in the scene I was part of in Waterloo and in some of the other work that I've been doing, and I think this kind of culture is also the sort of thing that shows up in like a Quaker meeting, maybe in some other dialogue groups, maybe in stuff like circling as well, or surrendered leadership. Is you have people and you're like blah 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 blah. And so there's this kind of space of like, and there's maybe also a little bit of like blah 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 blah. So there's this kind of space of with high considerateness, it's you're actively handing the other person the turn to talk. With high involvement, also known as interruptive, it just ends up being called that. You are sort of taking the talking stick. With high considerateness, you are giving the talking stick. And with this other thing, which I don't have a name for, probably should come up with a name for it. You're releasing the talking stick. You're not sort of holding on to it and running with it in the way that you would in high involvement, but you're also not throwing it at someone like, so how was your day? Right? Like kind of like that. You're sort of more like going, like, here's a question for the group. I'm interested if anyone has an answer, um, or just, something where you're saying something and you're just sort of leaving space. And, if someone wants to step in, they can. I'm curious if there are like other, like I've seen this distinction between high considerateness and high involvement, but I think I've usually rounded off the kind of culture I'm thinking of as being high considerateness when my sense is it's technically not. That considerateness has more of that turn-taking energy and more kind of now you speak. So yeah, thoughts on what to call this thing?
I mean, while you were talking, my mind flashed on the relationship with presence. I wondered, like, is this something related to high presence? I'm not super sure. It was more of a question than a claim. Like, there's a sense in which it feels like high considerate and high involvement. Like they're almost like clinging a little bit of like trying to adhere a little bit to a thing.
Yeah,
Like,
that's sort of my sense too.
Like high involvement feels like I gotta say something. It's
yeah.
and
Gotta fill the silence.
Yeah, and high considerative is more like I gotta respect others.
Yeah.
Whereas this one feels like I just let happen what wants to happen.
Yeah,
Importantly,
importantly, with high involvement, you do get I didn't quite depict it right earlier, but you do get like if this person's saying blah 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 blah, then you'll get like blah 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 yeah blah 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 yeah totally blah 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 oh man yeah this reminds me of this thing yeah blah 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 blah. Like you get sort of people kind of, they're not quite taking the stick, but they're kind of like reaching out and being like yeah right. And this is why it's called high involvement, because it's part of how you're showing respect to the person that you're talking to is by those active and getting all up in what they're saying and trying to finish their sentences, and 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 that's part of why, it's not just high considerateness folks feel like the high involvement folks are being rude, but the high involvement folks also feel like the high considerateness folks are being rude. Like they're not involving themselves. They're sort of,
Mhm.
you know, um,
Suspicious.
yeah, yeah. And so I think, a kind of a flowing between the two of those is really good. But then having maybe, yeah, more of that, the present quality, or the spacious, like high spaciousness, maybe could be a way to point at the other one. I don't know, high unknown, right? It's something kind of like high nebulosity. I don't know, like high.
I'm curious. I would want to see, like, so from our conversation and from our chat and with people of our chat, I tend to feel that high presence, high unknown tend to kind of like verge to lots of silences. Like there are abundant silences. And I'm curious of like, how does it look like when it moves towards closer to higher involvement? Like, how do you do the spaciousness thing, the just let anything that wants to be said, when both people have a lot of things they want to say?
Yeah. Well, so here's one dynamic that I've sometimes seen is, I don't know if I can quite illustrate it using this. I think they're both basically just going to be touching the thing the whole time, but it's sort of like, um, you know, so so blah 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 things and stuff. Oh yeah, that reminds me of this thing. Yeah, I want to hear about that, but like let me finish my thing first. Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so anyway, as I was saying about this thing, blah 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 blah. Oh right. Anyway, so the other thing though that I wanted to bring in is actually relevant to the thing you were saying earlier, which was this thing. Oh, I wanted to say something else about that actually. Okay, go ahead and then I'll finish. Okay, like, and there's almost like they're they're sort of actively negotiating who's going to talk, right? So it's not trying to take, and it's not like trying to give, or like, give. It's more like there's a bit of take and give, and that's different from, there's sort of neither take nor give. You're just like resting the thing like into the center, and now we've got a 2x2.
Doing. What's
Well,
the
yeah,
two
so
by?
we've got like high take, high give, and then you can have like high take and give, and you can have like low take and give, which is this one, the chill one, and then you can have high take, which is high involvement, high give, which is high considerateness.
Yeah, we do.
Boom, 2x2. Nice dichotomy you got there. Would be a shame if another axis were to happen to it.
But there's a feeling in which the spaciousness thing starts in the low, in the bottom left quadrant, and then like you learn there, and then you can move
Yeah. It's, I mean,
upward.
well, I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, so to some extent, it's like, because when I think of the people that I've had very high involvement conversations with, when it's working really well, and when we're really attending to what we want to talk about and why, as opposed to just like sharing like funny stories or something, and we're kind of just jockeying for who gets to talk. But like when we're really attending to what we want to talk about and why, it does tend to move sort of towards that um, high give, high take quadrant. So I think that can be a vector too. Um,
Yeah, and
but
likewise
yeah,
for high conscientiousness,
high
when there is
considerateness.
really something, high considerateness, when there is really something you are interested in evolving, you tend to worry less about turns taking
Mm.
and moving towards no, actually move upwards towards high give, high take. Like energy moves you upwards, right?
Yeah. And well, Maybe. I mean, I'm thinking about like, so like another pattern, maybe this is going to become a 2 by 2 by 2 cube by the time we're done with it. But like so another pattern, right, is like the uh well, okay, two other patterns. One is the monologue. The first chunk of this bit that we've been recording, like I was monologuing. And then I did actually a give move at the end of the monologue, I noticed. I was like, what do you think we should call this thing? Right? I just like, yeah, and it wasn't so much that I wanted you to have an answer to that question. Like in that sense, I wasn't asking you a yes or no question that you sort or a not just yes or no. I wasn't asking you a question that you sort of would have to have an answer to, like what did you do today or something like that. So there's a lot more space for you to go, well, I mean, here's a thing on my mind. But it was the give move was partially to get me out of monologue mode, right? Um, but so monologue is one mode, and then a different mode is interview or antagonistically interrogate, right? It's where sort of one person is asking all the questions, but the other person sort of is doing all the talking. So there's sort of like a who's controlling what we talk about and who is doing the talking is maybe like another axis. And so in a monologue, you've got I'm controlling what we talk about and I'm doing the talking. In an interview or a interrogation, you've got you know, like you're controlling what we talk about and I'm doing the talking. And then there's a separate question of sort of what the ratio of those is or something, or like what the tempo is of all of that. I don't know how this makes a 2 by 2 to be clear.
No, I think you said what the tempo is of that, but I think the tempo is even another thing.
Oh no.
Like what you're talking about is almost like the director, like, yeah, like who's directing this thing?
Yeah.
If we ask even an equal number of questions, it's like co-created flow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's asking the questions and doing the talking.
I wouldn't say that just asking an equal number of questions is quite co-creative. It's sort of um it's balanced, but like when it's really co-created, it's like there's like a that's where you get more of that unknown feel. I mean, this is me partially using co-creative as sort of a more jargony type of word, like getting really nuanced into like, you know, like it's using the word co-creative in the sense in which like if I, build one tower of a sandcastle and you build another tower, that's not co-creative. But if we like design it
Yeah,
together, then it's co-creative or something.
yeah. I think it's a more of a crude measure.
Yeah, yeah.
But the tempo is more like if you just interpret it in musical terms, like what's the tempo of our conversation?
Mm-hmm.
Like there are conversations that can be like, you can almost recall the tempo of a conversation in your mind, no? Like there are conversations that are like really regular silence. Like you have, I don't know, a 20-second silence every 3 minutes. And then
Yeah.
people pop, 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 pop,
Well,
pop.
and to some extent, there's tempo on kind of two scales, or what we might call tempo and rhythm, or something like that. Um, I don't know. I mean, it's the difference between so like I once worked for somebody who spoke very slowly and with a lot of pauses, and partially because he was CEO of the org, maybe, but he had three co-founders, which itself I'm not going to comment on. But he was not exactly top of the org, but the way that he spoke was just very commanding, even though he spoke with a lot of pauses. And so there wasn't a sense of like I'm going to interrupt him because he had this sort of presence that was sort of saying, okay, I've got something to say here, and I'm going to speak till I'm done. So that's a slow tempo and also non-interruptive, or sort of it's also what do I mean by non-interruptive?
I think you are somewhat pointing to status. And I
Well, I mean
think
that's a dimension of it, but I don't think that's the only thing that causes it. Like sometimes people will just talk slowly, and that's separate
status,
from how often they interrupt each other.
But I feel status is relates a lot to space.
Mm-hmm.
So when you take more space in conversation, that has a relationship to status.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you take that space with pauses and silence, it's even a stronger status signal, because like you're almost taking the space and doing nothing with it.
Mm-hmm.
There is another dimension of status is like the fact that you're spacious, but you're also very composed.
Yeah. I'm thinking about two things, or sort of related things. So the scene I was part of in Waterloo, in addition to having a group of people living together that I was part of for a long time, it also had for many years, a Monday night meeting that would be sort of 2 hours or 2.5 hours or something like that. And the and the meeting would always open with, I think, a short presentation of something, a poem or a couple pages from a book or a short audio clip or something like that. And then everybody in the group would get the chance to speak once, uninterrupted, with no time limit on that. And if you didn't want to go when it came around to you, you could pass and it would sort of come back around. And there's something I think that and we often found this opening round to be kind of onerous and difficult. Like, people would talk for a long time. You'd have 5 to 15 minutes sometimes from people, which is pretty substantial. And if you've got a group of 10 people, that's most of your meeting right there. Um, and um, and so but one thing I remember reflecting at the time is that, and this relates to what you're saying, is it's almost like by each person giving each other person the chance to really speak whatever is present for them uninterruptedly. It's almost like we're all sort of granting each other a particular kind of status as part of the ritual of opening this conversation. And something about that was may have been part of kind of how the conversations came to be quite rich at the end of them. Like, it would often be very slow and painful getting going, but then the last hour to half hour would be like really juicy and rich, and like maybe that happened because we were sort of inviting everybody into a space of being profoundly respected by getting the chance to speak uninterruptedly for as long as they wanted. Yeah, which connects with the video of Kazra and I talking, and also with this, which just sort of recently came up on the timeline again for some reason, and also connects with this thing from the Synergetics book that is saying, basically, in order to have high synergy between people in conversation, everybody needs to be sort of regarding everybody else as roughly the same status, if not slightly higher status than them, which is sort of paradoxical in a sense, but it's possible to do, right? Like, everybody's slightly seeing each other as slightly, but not substantially, sort of more important or something like that. Yeah.
So we were reading a chapter about status in the Impro book club.
Yeah.
There's some people around at this part of Twitter are in the club, and something that was interesting, like we were discussing about status, and I asked the question like, can you guys imagine a statusless world? People struggled with that question, but one answer that came up that was quite interesting was from Matt Brockwell, I think, in which he was like, for him, the most beautiful utopia, or like imaginable world without status, is a world where status flows. Status exists, but it flows frictionless.
Yeah.
When a person has something very beautiful, very unique, very important to say, they're suddenly received all the status to be listened. or
Right. They suddenly get deeply listened to, and sort of no matter how much money you have, if you're trying to waste people's time, they kind of they feel free to kind of
yes.
back away, kind of like or whatever, not whatever. I don't try to waste people's time, blah 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 blah.
Yeah, and so when you were talking about your example, I was thinking about like, because you were saying it was painful at the beginning, but then reaching the end. And my understanding was like, maybe one of the reasons it was painful at the beginning was because there was some pushing of people to get maybe out of their default, because some people are more comfortable with approaching things as low status. Other people are comfortable with approaching things as high status.
Mm-hmm.
It's, the way they approach interaction and conversation, like they have a bit of a default. And when you have a very structured thing, you're kind of like pushing people to be like, when you don't speak, even if you're someone that always wants to say things, you got to be low status and listen deeply. And when you speak, even if you're someone that is more introverted and really likes to listen, then you got to own it. You got to own that moment. You really deliver an input. So the difficult at the beginning, enjoyable at the end, almost made me think that there was some element of kind of like pushing people into moving more around their status, which then could have led to the richness as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think part of the difficulty also came from people get people were I'm gonna just say all of us in general, some of us more at different times, were not consistently able to really use the time in a way that respected everybody else or something. It was almost like okay, I can share whatever I need to share to get present, and people would kind of go, what do I need to share to get present? Well, there's this thing and there's that thing and there's this other thing. And they're kind of tuned out a little bit from like the scene into which they're sharing it. And so and that was, I think, part of why people sort of went on for lengths that other people felt frustrated with, is there was sort of like I don't really feel like you're valuing my time in speaking to me, right? So and that's a double, so there's sort of a double aspect to it, right? It's like, if you can't make everybody feel high status by giving everybody the chance to piss on each other, right? Like it's sort of, now we're, because people don't feel high status when they're pissed on, right? They feel pissed off, in fact. Yeah, but I do think in general what you're saying does point to something. Like there was some sort of stretching, I think, that happened, and then part of what was interesting was the stretching only lasted, for another few hours, and then we would kind of go back to our usual defaults usually, and sort of, yeah. This is one of the things that I'm wanting to explore in my, ongoing like research with stuff, is like get, what does it look like to get people into some temporary different state of like how they're having conversation, and why can that same group, well, and if not, why not, that same group sort of pick up where they left off, or do we have to sort of restart from a cold engine again?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of frictionless status is very related to leaderlessness.
Right, the kind of surrendered leadership
vibes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The fact that some people were pissed off is not necessarily a bad sign. It could also have been a sign that their high status was being stretched.
I mean, I think that was part of it.
Yeah. And this, like you say, it's not just for conversation. It might get even more interest when it translates into action. I feel when we talk about also co-consciousness dynamics, like for me, a very well working group, like a very frictionless group, is also a group where each individual brings this status flexibility, where they're easily willing to be in this kind of like demanding position and being very upfront about their need, and they can as easily move into a very giving position. where
Mhm.
they're like, I'm happy to follow you, and in
Right.
this
Yeah.
this dynamic. And I feel that moves a lot around the status spectrum.
Yeah, and where even the question of how it moves and when it moves itself is subject to that same I almost want to just say that same mystery, because it's not like, because if it's always, one person who is getting to decide who gets what status positions or whatever, well, then you just have status but on a meta level, right? Like you have fixed status on a meta level. So there's this kind of this flow also of, you know is it the case that like the person who's, giving is always choosing to enter into a giving mode? Well, maybe kind of, but also maybe sometimes they're being invited into it, and there's no kind of single answer to how any of it happens.
Yeah, yeah, because if the norm is very strong, it means there's someone with higher status, that someone or some group somewhat fixed the norm at some
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And going back all the way to where we started, like I can see cultures in which I always forget the name, what was
High
high con,
considerateness.
high considerateness. I can see how that can be a bit meta-fixed, like cultures in which they're almost like a bit of an imposed norm of
Yeah,
being high
yeah.
considerate.
Yeah, where it's just like you're rude if you talk for more than a couple minutes without handing off the mic.
I'm less familiar on how the high involvement can be meta-fixed. Like where did the meta-fixation of that comes from?
Oh, I mean, the feeling from just inhabiting it from the inside is like I am literally incapable of shutting up until somebody else talks over me.
Mm.
Like I just have to keep talking.
But
Um,
where does that, where that sort of like feeling of like inflexible norm comes from? Where do you think it comes from?
that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, people talk about like the need to fill silence, right? And so maybe there's some implicit cultural belief that if there's silence, then things are awkward, or we have nothing to talk about, or uh, something like that, or
Mm-mm-mm.
or people aren't interesting.
Yeah, yeah, could be. It sounds reasonable.
I think that's at most half of it, though. I think there's probably some other dimension. Yeah.
You want to say any more about this topic?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think we kind of came to a natural pause there. Speaking of pauses and silences,
Yeah.
so I'll stop the recording. Oh, one last thing. There's going to be a bunch of links to some of the resources that we just talked about in the thingy. Um, yeah, so you can click those. Yeah, 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 yeah. Double pointing down here somewhere.